What's up, all? So, I said the other day in my stories how I was traveling home from a trip and I had listened to the Joe Rogan podcast with Robert Kennedy Jr. and that I needed to talk about it because I had a story to tell. So, I really haven't ever really come on here and spoken like this and talked about my background. And so Joe Rogan opens up that podcast. I'm going to assume whoever's watching this maybe hasn't seen it. So I'll give you a little background on what it was about. And so Rogan opens up asking RFK where he came to his controversial opinions about the things that he has. So he says that he started out as an environmentalist, and so in 1983, mind you, that was 4 years before I was even born, so this is all legacy stuff that he is talking about and that I'll be talking about. It's all legacy things that literally have been going on since before we were, my generation was born, the millennials, the before even, some of our parents and our grandparents, because some of the stuff from 1932, whatever, that's generations. This has really been going on, and we're kind of just now dealing with the repercussions of it all. And so he goes on to say that he was an environmentalist, and so he was actually working with commercial fisheries on the Hudson River in 1983 and created this campaign thing. Basically they had boats that were patrolling the river and going after polluters and then suing them. And so he was going after them because there was high level of mercury in the fish. And so he was going around to these conferences, and these women kept showing up at them, sitting in the front row. They were different runs of them every time, and they would say, if you are going after these corporations for mercury in the fish, why are you not going after these corporations for mercury in vaccines? And so the mercury in the fish is a different type of mercury than is in the vaccines. However, mercury is mercury is mercury, and it's still toxic as hell. It's actually 1,000 times more toxic than lead. And so mercury, the knowledge that I have, so I went to school for geology, and I graduated in 2011 from Salem State in Massachusetts. So I'm born and raised in Massachusetts, kind of have it's weird Kennedy ties to Massachusetts. I got my geology degree. However, I graduated not as a single 24-year-old woman. I graduated as a single, there's a spider just crawling over here, sorry. I graduated not as a single woman, but as a single mother. I had a 2.5-year-old, and so I had to get a job as soon as possible. And I ended up in the environmental field. So I took a job in Somerville, Mass. For an environmental consulting company called Triumvirate Environmental, and they get hired by pharmaceutical companies, so life sciences, healthcare, higher education, and industrial niches. And so they get hired by these companies to consult for their hazardous waste disposal. And so I wasn't on the side of the environmental side of suing people. I was on the environmental side of keeping the companies in compliance of EPA regulations. And so I had certain accounts that I would take care of on a, everyday different account, weekly basis. And I had to go into these facilities, collect the chemicals that needed to be disposed of, but there's no way on a planet. And so I would just have to put them in drums, and they get shipped to landfills or incinerators. And I found out, I don't think our stuff went to those. I don't know, though, if they went to underground injection wells. And so a lot of the stuff we were sending to an incinerator was an incinerator in Grafton, Ohio. And so where those trains derailed, whatever, a few months ago, in Ohio, just north of there, there's literally a hazardous waste incinerator that Massachusetts institutions and Northeast institutions, because the company I worked for, they weren't just in Massachusetts, it was the like they serviced the Northeast and into the Mid-Atlantic. And this wasn't the only hazardous waste company. There's other ones in the area. And so it's a very huge lucrative business of these chemicals that have to be disposed of per EPA regulations. However, what they're doing with them is literally just putting them in the ground. And there's no, in these landfills that they're putting them in, they will eventually fail. Like, we live on a planet. So I was dealing with all EPA regulations and DOT regulations because we were transporting these chemicals over the roadway. So I actually had a commercial driver's license with a hazardous waste endorsement. It was required for this job, as was my degree, even though it was nothing to do with what I went to school for, and it paid like shit. And so one of my accounts, so all right, let's go back to RFK. So back to his what he was talking about, the mercury in the vaccines. And so he goes into how the vaccine schedule for children, they have hepatitis B on it, and it's given to newborn babies, like day old, 3 hours, whatever, like newborn babies, that has extremely high levels of this thimerosal in it, the mercury compound, not to mention other chemicals, because it's not just that. And so this hepatitis B, it makes no sense because it's meant for high risk people such as prostitutes and, like, you know, he said promiscuous homosexuality or whatever. So the pharmaceutical industry created that vaccine for that group, but they weren't able to sell it. And so instead they decided, let's get it on the vaccine schedule, because there's laws in place that allow vaccine companies to not be liable for vaccine injury. And so there was this huge, like, gold rush basically to manufacturing vaccines in the 80s, because they knew that no matter how crappy and terrible and toxic and dangerous their product was, they were not going to be able to be liable for that. And so pharmaceutical industries, according to RFK, it's like cashing $1 billion check basically if you get a vaccine on the childhood schedule. And so the spider just, like, really loves me, but it's kind of, I mean, I'm kind of scared of spiders. I don't know. So he, like, was talking about how it made no sense for this Hep B. And so, for instance, every Tuesday and Thursday in Watertown, Massachusetts, I went to Enanta Pharmaceuticals. Well, Enanta was manufacturing Hep B vaccines or researching whatever. And so they had a lab that had live Hep B in it. It was a BS, like, 2 level lab. So in that room that they had it in, you just had to wear a little bit extra PPE than personal protective equipment than other parts of the facility. But so I was going there every Tuesday and Thursday to walk into the labs and collect the chemicals that needed to be disposed of. And so to manufacture the vaccine, they were using tons of solvents. So some of them were halogenated and some were non-halogenated. And what I would do is I would go into the lab, and they had 5-gallon carboys of these solvents mixtures that I would pick up and walk to the main accumulation area. And when I got there, they had a big hood that had 55-gallon steel drums in it, and I would take the 5-gallon carboy and I would dump it into the 55-gallon drum. And that is what the industry calls consolidation. And they consider that to be a waste-saving, like, thing, even though it's still going to, well, sometimes, like, they could go to waste energy, but landfilling or incineration, in incineration, you're still going to end up with this toxic ash at the end of it all, and you're getting also the particulate matter that's toxic coming out of the stacks, like, no matter what. And, like, RFK was going after the coal industry because there's mercury that's just naturally occurring in coal deposits. Coal is a sedimentary rock, and so it's in the geology. And so when they expose this coal, which is literally million-year-old swamps that have been turned into rocks, it gets rained on, so its elemental mercury is liquid at room temperature. It's a silver liquid, and so when it gets heated, it turns into a vapor, but it's an element, so it never degrades, and therefore when it hits the air, eventually it's going to fall down back with the rain, and it gets onto the landscape that way, and that's how it contaminates the fish. And so they're dumping also chemicals into the rivers, which is still legal. So yeah, the EPA exists, but however, the Clean Water Act is really just a permitting law. So the companies just have to go get a permit from the EPA to say, we're going to be discharging these chemicals into the water. And so they have to report with the toxic release inventory, the TRI, to the EPA what they're releasing into the rivers. And so like, he was talking about the Hudson used to catch fire, and it was changing colors and whatever else. And this is a story of rivers all over the country. Even like in Ohio, there was rivers that were catching on fire. And no, they're not catching on fire now, but they're still just as toxic because the companies are still able to dump chemicals into the rivers. And they're also able to, the EPA limits, they only regulate 90 contaminants in drinking water. And so every other chemical, which there are thousands of chemicals, like literally 60,000 chemicals, like more than that, 80,000 chemicals, and they only regulate 90 of them. And so also their thresholds are higher than what they should be on some of these chemicals. So regardless, we are not seeing a like reduction of chemical disposal in our rivers or in our air, and even though the EPA exists, because it's really bought and paid for, and the laws favor the corporations. And so I was going into this lab for Nanta, and on the half day, on Thursday, I had a half day. And so I would have to take a truck that day that was full of chemicals that I would need to drive after I left Watertown to go to Lowell, where their transfer station was. So this was a big facility where they held all the chemicals until they were ready to be shipped to Ross or in Ohio, or to whatever landfill they were going to, or if it was a waste to energy facility, wherever the end disposal facility was, these chemicals were waiting in Lowell until they went to that facility. And so the mercury thing really strikes me too, because so EPA mercury is a RCRA 8 heavy metal, as when it's hazardous waste. And so it's considered hazardous no matter what form it's in. It has to go out regulated by the EPA as hazardous waste. And so one of my accounts was also Tufts Medical School. And so I had to go collect a 30-gallon container of teeth because they had mercury fillings in them. And that's FDA approved. So, but they had to be disposed of properly per EPA regulations. And so this is also where there's a disconnect between the FDA and the EPA. And also, like RFK was saying in his talk, that the EPA is bought by the coal industry and the petroleum industry and pesticides, and not by pharma, because pharma is regulated by the FDA. And so they did a study, and they found basically that we're being poisoned, like point blank. Like the vaccines are dangerous because of the chemicals in them. And they're not just putting mercury in them, there's all these other chemicals that are going into them, and there's even fetal stem cells in them. And I also went into a lab, so we had to do lab moves sometimes. So even if it was on campus, sometimes like from one area in the campus to the next, we would have to move the chemicals properly. So if they were across the roadway too, you would have to, we put them in a drum, the barrel, what we call drums, and you have to pack them so they don't break in transport, and then we have to unpack them, and they need a bill of lading and all sorts of protocols you have to go through in order to move chemicals from one lab to the next. And so this particular lab that we went into was another pharma lab, and they literally had aborted fetuses in hundreds of containers that I had to treat like garbage and put in a fucking 55-gallon drum so it could be shipped to the next facility that they were going to be moving into. And these are the things that I saw when I worked at this job for 2 years. I had no idea this kind of thing even existed. But I just was trying to make ends meet. And I ended up leaving that job and going to this industrial facility. So it was a chemical manufacturer, A.W. Chesterton, 150-year-old company in Groveland, Massachusetts, and it happens to be located on a Superfund site. So this land that they are on was contaminated prior to them owning it. So contaminated, it's one of the most contaminated places in the country that it's on the EPA's Superfund list. And so at this site, I was in charge of managing the hazardous waste for this company. And so I just had to, they were a large quantity generator, which means they were required by the EPA to ship their hazardous waste off site every 90 days. And so they didn't accumulate so much so that they were shipping like every week or anything, but I had quarterly shipments. So I had 4 shipments a month of chemicals that needed to be disposed of from the manufacturing process. And so I ended up actually, the contractor that I used was Triumvirate. They were already a contractor there before I took the job, and I had no clue until I took the job that they were, but because I never ended up being in a industrial facility while I worked at Triumvirate. And so basically when I was at Chesterton, I had my own office, and I was like, had tons of time